today. Welcome everyone to the second in a series of 3 webinars developed to help MSPI, DVPI, and GenI grantees work through the process of data collection. The title of this series is I Have My Local Data Collection Plan, So What's Next? And the title for this second webinar is Creating a Data Management Plan. So before we get too far along, we wanted to mention a few housekeeping items. First of all, I did want to mention that we are recording this webinar and that will be made available to everyone, to all of the grantees. You should have received a link to the recording from our first webinar. We plan to follow suit with this one, as I mentioned, so that folks who are not able to make it, or for those who need a refresher, are able to access not only the recording, but also the slides. I also wanted to mention that we have enabled chat in the Zoom software, so that if you have any questions, you can type them in and we will get to them as quickly as we can during the call today. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started and find out who has joined the meeting. If you could please just announce your name, where you are from, and the purpose area for which you've been funded, that would be great. I'll go ahead and start. My name is Corey Smith. I am with the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board Epidemiology Center and the technical lead on the MSPI DVPI evaluation team.
Hello?
Hello?
This is Letoy Lenderman. I'm the DVPI project coordinator for White Buffalo Calf Women's Society. Were you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome.
I'm going to be it that way. I'll come check it out.
Who else is on the call? We're taking roll call right now. Could you please announce yourself? I see a number of you have muted yourselves or have been muted. Go ahead.
Hey, Corey, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Amy Muchna. I'm calling in remotely, so hopefully I don't have any weird background noise, but I'm on the call as well. Evaluation coordinator for the Great Plains Tribal Epicenter.
Who else is on the call? I see some other names up here. I see Kelly LeBeau. I see Jay Lofton. Let's see, I see a T. Remick, but you've all muted yourselves. Could you please introduce yourselves? Can anyone hear me?
Yes. This is Letoy. I can hear.
Who is that?
This is Letoy.
Okay, Latoy.
Hi, Corey. This is PJ, Director of the Great Plains Tribal Epidemiology Center.
Good morning. This is Marcita from Rosebud.
And Corey, it looks like Jody clocked in or checked in with the chat down there. Jody from Cheyenne
Yep.
River.
Jody Lofton, Acting Director for the MSPI program in Eagle Butte. Welcome, Jody. Anyone else? Kelly LeBeau, who are you are about to meet in the next slide. There she is, has joined via the chat. She's having some technical difficulties. Kelly is our overall project lead for the technical assistance team here at the Health Board. And she has recently joined the team in that capacity. Someone named T. Remick, not quite sure who you are, but I think that pretty much covers just about everybody. Someone is typing ferociously in the background. Could you please put your... The MSPI, DVPI, and GenI grantees. The purpose and overarching theme of the series is to provide MSPI, DVPI, and GenI grantees with the background knowledge, skills, and tools needed to implement a local data collection and evaluation plan that documents your progress toward meeting project goals and objectives, and to determine the impact of activities on individuals and the larger community. I also wanted to let everyone know that this webinar series, by the way, is completely optional. You are not required, nor is there even an expectation that you take advantage of the information that we share. We are simply offering it in the event that you might be looking for some tools and a way to move forward with your data collection activities. We understand that some folks may have a tried and true method that works for them, and that's okay if you're completely satisfied with that. So any questions so far about the series, about this particular webinar, or about anything pertaining to your grant before we dive in? Okay, well then, hearing none, let's go ahead and get started. So 2 weeks ago, about this time, we reviewed the IHS requirements for your local data collection plan. We talked about the project evaluation cycle, the hallmarks for successful evaluation, as well as the role and importance of data in the evaluation process. We also introduced a few terms so that we could all have and to share a common vocabulary in talking about data and to facilitate communication moving forward. It is our understanding that a few of you have not yet received approval for your local data collection plans, but many of you have. But no matter which group you happen to find yourself in, so for example, if you did receive approval or did not, or even which purpose area you happen to be, what we present today should be general enough to apply to most situations that you encounter throughout your data collection. So, in essence, what you can expect from this webinar are some basic principles and concrete steps that will kind of help you in the transition from planning your local data collection plan to actually implementing it. So up till now, the technical assistance that we've provided has really been focused on developing a plan for your data collection and evaluation. And so what we hope to accomplish today is to provide you with some actual steps, if you will, a kind of recipe that you can follow for actually implementing that plan that we've talked about in the past. Some of you have already started collecting your data, and that's great. So, so if what you're doing, again, as I mentioned earlier, if that works for you and you're happy with that, continue doing it. And so what we offer is something that we invite you to take what you want and to leave the rest. There's one more point that I'd like to make. We realize that there are other members who may be on your team who actually may be responsible for evaluation, and please feel free to keep them in the loop and share this information with them as well. So today, I will introduce the whole concept or notion of data management, and then talk a little bit about what it is, and then how to actually manage your data, and we'll walk through that process step by step. I'm not sure that we'll get to any worked examples, but if you all had some examples that you wanted to share during the call, feel free to do that as time permits. And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A, and then we would like to give you some time to ask any additional questions. And then finally, at the conclusion, we'd like you to evaluate our performance, how we did on this webinar today. This is the first time we've ever done this, and so we'd like to have your feedback. So what is a data management plan? A data management plan is essentially a document that outlines what data you will collect, procedures for data collection, any data management practices, the conditions or terms under which you might want to share your data, as well as plans for reporting and the long-term preservation of your data. One way that I like to think about a data management plan is that it serves as a kind of implementation strategy or playbook for your evaluation. So the data that you're going to collect, the sources you plan to use for those data, the procedures for collecting quality data, and handling and reporting your data are all elements that would be considered part of your data management plan. There are several reasons why we think it's important to have a data management plan in place. First, it ensures that your project data are accurate, that they're complete and usable for your evaluation. Because at the end of the day, you need to evaluate your project and all the activities associated with that project. Secondly, and that is its core function, but it also supports the housekeeping function of finding, storing, and retrieving details about your project, especially when you need them for reporting purposes. It can save time through improved efficiency of project operations and can serve as an historical record for any publications that you might want to pursue as a result of your work, other projects, or grants as well. There are what I would consider four major sets of data management activities. First, you want to be able to specify what data collection methods and procedure you're going to use. Secondly, once you've collected your data, you want to be able to assess the quality of those data, and we'll provide you with some guidance on how to go about doing that. Thirdly, you want to be able to manage your data for ease of access and manipulation, because the data, the raw data that you collect may not always be in a form that that's reportable, either to your funding agency or to stakeholders in your community. And then finally, you want to be able to summarize your data to facilitate reporting. Any questions so far about the purpose of data management, why we do it, and what activities are involved in that process? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to talking about just how to get started with the data management. So your data requirements for evaluation come from two sources. The first source is the one that you guys have been working on, which is your local data collection and evaluation plan. So you may want to consult that as you begin to think about and pursue the collection of your data. As you may recall, there were two different formats that you can use. There was the one that we provided, and some of you used that evaluation framework. And then there was another format that the Indian Health Service provided to you to use as well. Again, it doesn't matter which form you decided to use, but because everything that we're going to mention on this webinar is going to apply. And then the second source is the guidance that IHS hasn't yet provided, but at some point in time, you're going to have to submit semi-annual progress reports. And so we anticipate that guidance will be coming out sometime in the months ahead. And so you want to pay attention to the kinds of data that they are going to be asking for in those progress reports. And my understanding, Amy and Kelly, is that that those data are going to be uploaded through an online portal. Is that correct?
That was my understanding.
Okay. So be on the lookout for that as well. So as you might recall, in the data collection section in your LDCP, there were actually 4 columns. in that spreadsheet. And so when you filled that out, you identified your data source, the method that you were going to use to collect your data, and the schedule for collecting the data, or how often you were going to do that, and then the person on your team that was responsible for collecting your data. So you might want to dust off your data collection and evaluation plans. Take a look at that again, and that's something that you're going to want to consult before you begin actually collecting your data. And then one thing that you'll need to determine is what kind of data source you're going to use as well. So as a bit of a refresher, there are two main types of data that you can collect or capture for your evaluation. You can collect original data. So you can go out and you can collect data that's specific to your project, that supports the evaluation of your project, or you can rely on what we call secondary data, which are data that are collected by someone other than you. These are existing data that are used for, that might help you benchmark your performance on some of your measures or indicators. And an example of that might be, you might want to be able to assemble a demographic profile, say, of the community that you're serving. And so you could obtain data from your State Department of Vital Statistics, or you might be, or the Census Bureau, in order to produce that demographic profile of persons living in your community. Any questions about primary and secondary data? Just want to mention that most of you that have submitted your data collection plans have decided to rely on primary data for the most part. In fact, when I looked through your plans, I didn't notice actually anyone, at least up till now, who was going to be collecting any secondary data. So I realize this is a busy looking flow chart. It may look a bit scary at first, but it is really nothing more than a breakdown of those 4 data management activities that I mentioned earlier on an earlier slide. So, and as I mentioned, your data collection process is general enough that you can apply this flow or this process to virtually any project that you might happen to be working on. So think of it as a blueprint for creating your data management plan, and we're going to keep coming back to some of the elements in or steps in this chart throughout the presentation. So let's step back for a moment and sort of try to understand the various activities and how they break down into their component parts. So if you start from the left, on the upper left-hand corner, you see an oval, and that's the starting point. And the starting point, again, is to determine what your data requirements are. And as you recall, I mentioned that there were 2 sources. There was your data collection plan that you've already proposed and had approved. And then there's also, for the semi-annual progress reports, you want to read the guidance for that when it comes out. So in your local data collection evaluation plan, you already determined, again, the source, the method, the schedule, and person responsible for collecting the data. And then, so if you follow along, if you follow the arrow downward, it brings you to a question, and it's a decision point in which you ask, do the data already exist to evaluate your project activity? And this is really that primary versus a secondary distinction. So as I said, I'm not aware that anyone is collecting any secondary data, but if you are, you would follow the arrow to the right and follow that path and the steps along that path at the top layer. If you follow the arrow down, and the answer to that question is no, then you're collecting primary data. So is everyone following at that up till now? Okay, so we're going to focus on that lower series of little boxes, steps 1 through 4. And so we're going to assume that you're collecting primary data. So we're right at the threshold of the box that reads number 1, or step 1, determine data collection method. But before we pursue that and talk about each of those different steps, I wanted to direct your attention to the top of the slide. So essentially, data management boils down to two different phases. So there's what we call the data collection phase, and that's steps 1 through 5, which are listed below. And then there's what we call the data handling and reporting phase. So again, data management consists of 2 main phases: the data collection phase and data handling and reporting. And we're gonna break this down as we move along. So all 9 of the steps that are depicted. So if you let your eye travel from left to right, you'll end up in the lower right-hand corner of this schematic, where another little oval box, and in it says it's the end. Okay, so all 9 of these steps really amount to nothing more than the implementation sequence for your data management plan, and so everything is contained in this flow chart. And I think I might have mentioned this earlier. One way that I like to think about the data management is like following a recipe in a cookbook. So you just follow the steps, then you should have a really nice way of an efficient and effective way of collecting your data, summarizing your data, making sense of it, and reporting it, and then archiving it for future reference. So in the remaining time that we have, I'm going to focus on, again, the lower track of boxes, which is concerned with collecting primary data. Okay, I'm going to stop for a moment and kind of check in with everyone. Are there any questions about this slide, this particular slide, about this flow chart? Okay, let's break it down into each of the steps, and this will make a lot more sense. So we saw that in step one, once we have, let me go back, once we've determined what kind of data we want to collect, this takes us right up to the threshold of this first step, determining your data collection method, which is right here. So last time we reviewed the different, in fact, in the training we had this last fall, we talked about the various different types of data collection methods, which are review of documents, which is nothing more than a summary of existing print materials or records. And I would say that of the different methods that you all selected, that about 3/4 of all of the instances really fall into this category of document review. And it includes like taking attendance at meetings, sign-in sheets, and that sort of thing. And then surveys. Not too many of you plan to use surveys to collect your data, but that's another data collection method that you could use if you wanted to. Focus group interviews. I think there might be a couple of projects that plan to conduct focus groups, and that's great. And so there are a different set of requirements for focus group interviews. And then finally, observation, which is nothing more than recording information about activities or processes. And there are various ways of doing that. Which brings us to step two. So once you've decided what your data collection method, what method you're going to use is, then you need to make a decision about what kind of a tool you plan to use. So for example, if you're going to be reviewing documents, then an example of that might be a sign-in sheet. So if you're hosting a training or a meeting of some sort, of course, you want to be able to track attendance, especially if those meetings occur on a regular basis. So what I've listed here on this slide are just a few questions that you can ask yourself as you think about what kind of tool you want to use for each of these various methods. So some considerations might be from whom you will be collecting data, or if it's a document, what documents you will be abstracting the data from. How will the tool that you plan to use be administered? Is it going to be in person? Is it going to be by phone? Is it going to be administered in some other way? Is it suited to the data that you are trying to capture? It's really critical that whatever instrument you use is matched to the type of data that you want to collect. And if you end up deciding to develop your own tool, you may want to consider piloting the tool with maybe 2 or 3, especially with surveys, you might want to choose maybe 2 or 3 individuals from your community to pilot the tool to make sure that it's something that they can comprehend. In other words, usable in the field, and that it's also user-friendly, something that you can employ without too much trouble. So, and then are you going to use any software, either for collecting the data or for storing your data? So for example, if you're collecting data using a paper form, you want to make sure that you have the software in mind for key punching those data into an electronic format. any questions about the selection or considerations for the selection of data collection tools? Okay, let's move on to step 3. So you've already identified the person who's going to be responsible for each data collection activity in your data collection plan. You've also laid out a data collection schedule. And so next are some factors to take in consideration when deciding whether or not you need to specify a set of written data collection procedures. And so these procedures might include the amount of detail or the data elements that you're going to be capturing or collecting. If it's a complicated process, you might want to outline the steps involved in collecting the data. However, this is probably not going to apply to many of your projects. But if you are collecting survey data, it's critical that you make sure that the data collection process is standardized, especially if you're going to be collecting the same data over and over again, or from a different group of people for comparison purposes. Another consideration is the sensitivity of the data. If you're collecting sensitive information, then you want to make sure that you follow a set of procedures that will ensure the confidentiality of those who are actually providing the data. So some examples of this might include data on health or mental health status, income, sexual behavior, or any illegal or illicit activities. So that's something to bear in mind. And will the data collectors need any special training? So I know we here at the Health Board, we hold a lot of meetings and training events for folks, and it doesn't really take any special training to put together, say, a sign-in sheet so that we can have a meeting roster of people who are participating. But other data collection efforts, say if it involves interviews or surveys, it may require some special training. And so you have to build that time into your, of course, into your work plan as well. And is there someone on the team who's responsible for ensuring that the data that you collect are of sufficient quality to support your evaluation? That's something to keep in mind as well. So, so here we finally arrive at step 4, and it's time to collect your data. And so once you've thought through some of these questions, once you've developed your data collection tool or decided on an existing data collection tool, you've established the procedures that you plan to use, then you're ready to go. You're ready to collect your data. So next up is, at this point, we've assumed that you've collected your data. Either you've collected it with paper and pencil or pen, or you've collected it in some other way. You've collected it electronically. So the next step after you've collected your data is to assess its quality. So there are different aspects to consider to data quality. And this is actually the final step in the data collection process. So, and this step actually applies as much to sign-up sheets at meetings as much as it does to large-scale surveys. So all the data that you collect are important. Because much of the data that you collect will be repeated over time. It's important to check any documents or forms immediately after the data are collected, and not wait until you build up a large batch. And the reason for this is that you might be able to recover any missing data. So for instance, if someone filled out a survey, but they forgot to fill in or complete some of the fields in the survey, you can go back to them and get those data. So as you might gather, completeness is really important. You don't want you don't want fields in your tool or your instrument to have missing or unknown responses. You need to make sure that your data are reliable, that they're recorded accurately and consistently, timely, and then also accessible. You want to make sure that other members of your team can easily access the data. And then finally, it's important again to kind of keep in the back of your mind the importance of privacy and confidentiality, and which includes not just making sure that people who shouldn't have access don't have access to your data, but that it's also protected from corruption. You don't want data sitting on a computer that isn't adequately protected from malware or from viruses. Make sure that you back up your data as well. And any paper form should be kept under lock and key, and any data that are held on a computer should be at minimum password protected, and certainly for sensitive data, you might want to consider encrypting those data as well. And there's lots of free products available out on the internet that will allow you to encrypt the data so that no one can get in and access it and disclose somebody's identity. Any questions about considerations when assessing the quality of the data that you've collected? Okay. So once you've assessed the quality of your data and are satisfied and have, if you discover that that there are some missing data and have gone back and gotten those data, then we move into really the next phase of data management, which is data handling and reporting. So the first step there is to, once you've collected your data and assessed its quality, is to really focus on summarizing your data. So again, one of the considerations in how you go about summarizing your data is to refer back to the reporting requirements. And those requirements are going to differ. We know that your funding agency, in this case IHS, has its own set of reporting requirements. But from time to time, I know that some of you may be called to give updates either to your tribal health committee or maybe even your tribal council. And so they may want to hear about your project and how it's going. And so that may call for a different set of reporting requirements. You may have an advisory board or committee that meets from time to time, and they may have a different set of reporting requirements. Or you may get to decide how you want to report the data to your stakeholders. So again, they're going to differ and need to be taken into consideration when summarizing your data. there are many different ways of summarizing your data. So one way is to use what we call summary measures to benchmark your performance on the various activities that you have listed in your data collection plan. And you can use, as examples, you can use counts or percentages. So for percentages, for example, you might want to look at completion rates. I know a number of you have set targets that you want to reach for some of your activities. And so this would be a prime opportunity to use summary measures for those. And so I would refer you to the measures that you prescribe for yourself in the indicator column of your data collection and evaluation plans. For those of you who are collecting quantitative data, you can use simple statistics, which are nothing more than numerical summaries of your aggregated data. And then there are various ways to display your data. And sometimes displaying the data in a more visual form is something that appeals more to folks, and actually can at times convey a lot of information much more effectively and efficiently. And I list some examples for the various options there. And there are other options as well that are available, but those are the main ones: graphs, charts, tables, and maps. So those are some ideas for how you might want to consider summarizing your data. So once you've summarized your data, you want to find out what you can learn from it. So it's really all about, what can I learn from my data? How can I make sense of it? And so for structured data, you can learn a lot just by browsing the rows and columns in your spreadsheet if you've entered your data into a spreadsheet. And that's, by the way, is a pretty sort of quick and easy way to uncover missing data. You may spot some values in a spreadsheet, for example, that look out of the ordinary or just don't seem right. They seem out of range for what you might expect, and they're not consistent with the other values on a given characteristic. And so again, you can actually incorporate this step as part of your data quality assessment in step 5. So when aggregating quantitative data, you can summarize it in ways that allow you to see patterns in the data. So for example, you can study relationships. You can look at how, say, one characteristic or property might vary or rise or fall with some other characteristic. I know that you can, in Excel, you can actually subgroup your data. If you have data on sex or age, or even, say, for example, zip code, you can make those kinds of comparisons. You can also study trends. So you can, if you're collecting data repeatedly, say from the same group of people over a period of time, you can look at change or variation over time. And then you can even further subgroup it. Any questions about, and so these are just a few ideas about how to make sense of your data, both internally for your team and then also for reporting purposes as well. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention just is that qualitative data can also present opportunities for looking at patterns. It isn't just quantitative data. Sounds like I'm hearing a lot of feedback. Someone unmuted themselves. Okay. but you might want to, so for example, if you're collecting data from focus group interviews, you might want to analyze, when you analyze the transcripts, you might, you're going to identify some themes that might emerge from your focus group interviews. And so that's a different kind of pattern, but it's a pattern nonetheless that you can also identify in your data, because in the case of qualitative data, such as focus group interviews, those are the types of patterns that you're going to be looking for. And we're getting close to, so now we're a couple steps from the end, but we've now arrived at the kind of the moment of truth where you get to report your data. So you've had a pretty good look at your data. You've identified some patterns in the data. You've already made some decisions about how you want to summarize it and to report it. So here you are, and it's now time to report your data. So sometimes it's helpful to have a communication plan which outlines or defines who your target audience is, the purpose of how you're going to, or the purpose of disseminating your data, as well as what is the core message, what is it that you want to convey, what is it you want to communicate with your data. May not be necessary, but if you're reporting to a number of different groups or constituencies or stakeholders, this is something you might want to consider. And then in the actual reporting itself, you want to be able to decide what content you want to highlight, how you want to present the content, and then what reporting method you want to use for presenting that content. And you want to think about what is the sort of the baseline knowledge of your audience, as well as the interest level. So you know if so something that might bear on this question is, you know, how much time you have. So if you really want to highlight your project or your program's accomplishments, and you don't have much time, then you have to think carefully about what it is you want your audience to hear. Are there any particular insights or lessons learned that you might want to share? How can you leverage what you learned in the whole data management experience that we've talked about into a more sustainable data system for your community? So you've already established a data management plan. Once the funding runs out, are there some data that you want to continue collecting, for example? Do you want to implement a system in your community for continued collection of some of the data that you collected under your grant? What thought have you given to how to evaluate the impact of your reporting and dissemination efforts? So when you reported your data out, when you reported your data to your key stakeholders, did it have an impact? And if it did, how do you know? So you might want to collect some feedback on that. And then last but not least, you've collected your data, you've developed some reports you've reported your data to your funding agency. You may have presented updates on your project to your community, and your funding's about to come to an end. So what do you do? You're sitting on all of this data. You've created all of these different reports. but it's important not to just lock it all away in a cabinet and not do anything with it without thinking through how all of this time and effort that you invested in this project could be put to use in the future. So one question that you might want to consider asking is, does your project or your tribe have a policy for data reuse and publications? So I worked on projects where we established, because we were collecting a lot of data, we established a data use and publication subcommittee. And so the folks that sat on that committee helped to develop some policies and principles for the storage of the data we collected, the terms or conditions under which the data might be released in any publications. If you have data sharing agreements, once your project ends, what does that mean in terms of data sharing with other agencies or programs? And you might want to, if you do plan to share your data or to release it to other people who might have an interest, you might want to establish an approval process for data requests as well. Is someone on the team or someone in your community responsible for the long-term maintenance of your data once the project ends? And do you have a place to securely store your original documents, as well as any electronic files? And are they securely stored? And then what procedures do you have in place to receive and evaluate any, which I alluded to earlier, any incoming requests for sharing or using your data? So so that's it. Those are the 9 steps and to data management. And so I'm gonna break here and kind of leave it open for discussion. Is any of this something that any of these practices or steps that I talked about, something that you're familiar with, that you've already used in the past on other projects? Are there some things that I said that might differ or kind of be at variance with your own experience? We'd like to hear that as well. Anyone?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Could you please say who you are?
In those mountains right there, so they play up that place was mountains, and that's not too far away from where they say Noah's archive was at, and then too far from there is the underground.
I'm having a hard time hearing you. There's a lot of background noise.
The whole all underground, and they're saying it's about 12,000 years old.
Hello?
Corey?
Yes.
Have a good day.
Corey, can you hear me?
Hello?
This is Marcita. Could you hear me?
Mike.
Yes, Marcita, I can hear you.
Okay, I have a question. The I don't know if it's the format or that picture of the progression or process of collection and all that. Somewhat confusing to me. I myself like to keep things simple, but with quality. And so I just I kind of got lost in the shuffle there. I understand the process, I guess, but it seems a little too much for me. Working with suicide prevention is something that is really heavy, a lot of work, and then but yet I realize the data is important. I guess I need to, because I missed the first webinar. I don't know if maybe that's what's causing me to be a little bit lost with what you're trying to have us do now. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So so there was a lot of material to digest in this webinar, and a lot of it is I tried to be pretty general. So there may be some parts of it that don't apply to you. Okay, so that's what I would say first of all, and I would say that may be the case for others on this call, but I think so for example, I'm somewhat familiar with your project, and so there is probably quite a bit that doesn't apply, but essentially what we wanted to do in this webinar is to just look at the process of data management in a way that it was pretty detailed, but in a way that would apply not simply to the kinds of activities that I know that you have planned for your project, but also apply to people who might be collecting more detailed data as well. And I also wanted to present it in such a way that the information in the webinar could be used for projects that are more data intensive, that are collecting a lot more data. So I thank you for your comment, and I realize that, and just to put this all into perspective, that data collection and data handling and reporting is just one component of a very large array of activities for all of the MSPI DVPI grantees. And the reason we presented it now, or presented this webinar at this time, is because we realize that much of your attention is focused on, and I know that you're already collecting data, but others may not be. And so I know the focus right now has really turned to those activities that are going to be involved with collecting data. And so we wanted to throw out just a few, some ideas, some principles, some tools that could be used in that process. Some way to hang your hat on this whole on data collection and evaluation.
So I got one more question, Corey.
Yeah.
You know, you talked about the secondary, what's the word? Secondary.
Secondary data.
Yeah. So is that, does that mean the information we're receiving from Indian Health Service, Behavioral Health Department, we get data from them, I think it's every other week or every week.
Mm-hmm.
Ideations, attempts, and completions. And so we can include that in our data then, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that would be a great example of a secondary data source.
Yeah, yeah, because they've actually given it to us. So, okay, yeah, there it goes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. You're welcome. So, you know, we've covered a lot of ground, and I realize, because of the time, that there might be some questions. So we didn't get to any examples today, but I think, as Marcita pointed out, data management plans can get to be quite detailed and intricate, and you may not need to as you formulate your data management plan, to be this detailed. So again, as I said at the outset, you know, take what's useful, leave the rest, and use it to your benefit. Any other questions, comments? So we had, when we talked about this initially, we thought we would do a complete series of 3 webinars. And so what I'd like to present to the group, or ask the group, is, would you find any value in having a third webinar? I'm trying to remember what we planned for the third webinar. I think the focus was going to be quality improvement, how to use your data to improve your program's efficiency. And again, this is something that is not something that is necessarily expected or required, but I know that some folks might have an interest in quality improvement, and it would just be kind of an introduction, kind of a primer on quality improvement, if there was any interest. Or when we talked about this, we thought we could. So that's one idea. Another idea is to hold a third webinar, but to leave it open-ended. And if there was a topic or something you guys wanted to, or a way in which you wanted to use that time for a third webinar, we'd certainly be receptive and open to that as well. So for example, if you wanted to work through an example, we could do that. Or there might be something that you've thought of that you'd like to see covered, that relates to data collection and evaluation that maybe hasn't been talked about or addressed.
I'd like the quality improvement.
So I heard someone say they're interested in the quality improvement.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I would like to see.
Okay. Anyone else?
I agree. Quality improvement would be good.
Okay. So we have two votes for another webinar on quality improvement. Any other topics people have an interest in? Let me ask a more general question. So are webinars like this, do you find them useful? Is this something we should try to do again, or is this something that maybe might not, maybe we should try another way to get this information out? Well, so we have some interest in another webinar on QI, or quality improvement. So let me meet with the other members of our team, and we can decide on how we might want to approach that, and also a date. Okay. What we'd like to ask, I know we planned an hour and a half for this webinar, so there's some time left. So what we'd like to ask is that you guys complete a short survey on your experience today to give us some feedback on the webinar that we had today. That would be greatly appreciated. And it won't take but a few minutes. And then Kelly is going to send that out to everyone.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining, and we will definitely be in touch.
Thank you, Corey.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
And this is Kelly, and just to remind you, within the next week, I'll be putting up the recording of this webinar. And if you didn't get the notice, I uploaded a copy of the presentation slides and audio recording of webinar session 1 to the GPTEC website, and sent that link to you in an email. So let me know if you didn't get that.
Thank you, Kelly.
You're welcome.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye. Bye, Corey.
Have a good day.
Have a good afternoon. How do you leave? Oh.
How do you hang this up? Just click that speaker thing again.